Today, I am going to tell you the story of a medal that was cursed. They called it the Devil's Medal. Every soldier who found it experienced impossible luck in battle, perfect aim, flawless strategy, supernatural survival. But there was a price. I promise you, by the end of this story, you'll never look at military honors the same way again.
Part 1. The Devil's Gift. Picture this. You're 19 years old, covered in mud and blood that isn't your own, and you've just watched your best friend die in your arms. The year is 1917, the Battle of Passchendaele. Hell on earth doesn't even begin to describe it. But what Private Tommy Henderson found that day would make the horrors of war seem like a gentle whisper compared to the screaming nightmare that was about to unfold. Tommy wasn't supposed to be there. He was supposed to be back in Manchester, working in his father's shop, maybe courting that pretty girl from down the street. But the war machine doesn't care about what you're supposed to be doing. It just feeds, and feed it did. The morning started like any other morning in that godforsaken wasteland. Artillery shells screaming overhead, the constant rat-a-tat-tat of machine gun fire, and the smell. Gah, the smell. Death has its own perfume, you know. Sweet, sickening, and it clings to everything. Your clothes, your hair, your soul. Tommy was part of a reconnaissance patrol, sent to check what was left of a German position that had been shelled the night before. 5 men went out that morning. Only one would come back with his sanity intact, and even that's debatable. They found the German trenches abandoned, mostly. Bodies scattered like broken dolls, some still clutching their rifles, others blown apart so badly you couldn't tell where one man ended and another began. War doesn't discriminate. It takes the young, the old, the brave, the coward. It takes them all. But then Tommy saw him, a German officer, probably no older than himself, lying face down in the mud. What caught Tommy's attention wasn't the man's death. Death was everywhere. It was what was pinned to his uniform. A medal, but not just any medal. This thing was beautiful and terrible at the same time, made of what looked like black silver, if such a thing could exist, with intricate engravings that seemed to move when you weren't looking directly at them. In the center was a symbol Tommy had never seen before, something that looked like a cross, but wrong somehow, twisted, evil. "Don't touch that thing, Tommy." That was Sergeant Williams, a veteran of 3 years who'd seen more death than any man should. But Tommy couldn't help himself. Have you ever felt drawn to something you know you shouldn't touch? Like when you were a child and your mother told you not to touch the hot stove, but your hand moved toward it anyway? That's what this was like, except 1,000 times stronger. The moment Tommy's fingers closed around the medal, the world changed. Not in a way you could see, but in a way you could feel. The air got colder, the shadows got deeper, and somewhere, far away, something laughed. The first sign that something was wrong was that very night. Tommy woke up screaming. Not unusual in the trenches. Nightmares were as common as rats and lice. But Tommy's screams were different. They weren't the screams of a man reliving battle. They were the screams of a man seeing something that shouldn't exist. He told the others about his dream, how he'd been standing in a vast cemetery, but the headstones were all wrong. They were covered in that same symbol from the medal, and from each grave came whispers in a language he couldn't understand, but somehow knew was promising him things, terrible things. "It's just shell shock, lad," said Sergeant Williams, but his eyes told a different story. Williams had seen men break before. This wasn't breaking. This was something else entirely. The second night was worse. Tommy didn't just dream, he walked. His bunkmates found him standing at the edge of no man's land at 3 in the morning, staring out at the German lines, whispering something under his breath. When they brought him back, he couldn't remember leaving his bunk. But it was the third night when everyone knew something was truly wrong. Tommy started speaking German, perfect German, the kind of German you only learn by growing up with the language. He was having conversations with people who weren't there, laughing at jokes in a language he'd never learned, singing songs that made the other soldiers' skin crawl. The medical officer examined him, found nothing physically wrong. He declared, "Battle fatigue. Give him a day's rest." But how do you rest when the thing you're carrying won't let you sleep? How do you find peace when you're wearing evil around your neck? Because Tommy was wearing it, you see, the medal. He'd put it on that first day and couldn't bring himself to take it off. Every Every time he tried, his hands would shake and his vision would blur. The metal had chosen him, and it wasn't letting go. The fourth night, Tommy killed a man. Not a German, not an enemy. Private Johnson, a boy from Yorkshire who'd been nothing but kind to everyone, found him with his throat torn out, and Tommy standing over him, covered in blood, with no memory of what had happened. They should have court-martialed him, should have put him against a wall and shot him for murder. But Williams saw the medal, really saw it, and when he looked at it, really looked at it, he saw something looking back. "That thing's cursed," whispered Williams to the captain. "I've heard stories. Medals like that, they come from places that shouldn't exist, made by people who sold their souls for power and war." The captain was a practical man, didn't believe in curses or ghosts or anything that couldn't be explained by military regulations, but he also didn't believe in taking chances, not with his men's lives. He ordered they get rid of it, but that was the problem. You couldn't just get rid of it. Tommy tried. Oh, how he tried. He threw it away, buried it, even tried to melt it down, but every morning, there it was, back around his neck, heavier than before, colder than before, hungrier than before. The fifth night, Tommy didn't sleep at all. He sat in the corner of the trench, rocking back and forth, whimpering about voices that wouldn't stop talking. He spoke of promises the medal was making him, promises of survival, of victory, of power. All he had to do was accept it fully, let it become part of him.
"It wants me to kill again," Tommy whispered to Williams. "It's so hungry, Sarge, and the things it shows me, the things it promises." Williams made a decision that night, a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his very short life. He couldn't let Tommy hurt anyone else, but he also couldn't bring himself to kill a boy who was as much a victim as those the medal had claimed. So he did the only thing he could think of. In the early hours of the morning, while Tommy was finally sleeping, the first real sleep he'd had in days, Williams carefully lifted the medal from around the boy's neck. The moment the chain broke contact with Tommy's skin, the boy's eyes snapped open, but they weren't Tommy's eyes anymore. They were black as coal and filled with something that had never been human. "You don't understand," the thing wearing Tommy's face whispered. "You can't break the chain. The metal chooses. The metal claims. The metal feeds." Williams ran. He ran like he'd never run before, clutching the cursed thing in his fist, feeling it burn against his palm like a piece of hell itself. Behind him he heard Tommy screaming, not in anger, but in agony. The metal had been ripped away from him, and something inside was dying. When Williams finally stopped running, he was 3 miles from camp, standing in a shell crater filled with stagnant water and the bones of men who died months ago. He looked down at the medal in his hand. It was beautiful. It was perfect. It was exactly what he'd been looking for his whole life. Williams put the medal around his neck and smiled. Somewhere in the distance he could hear Tommy screaming as his mind finally shattered completely. But that didn't matter now. Nothing mattered now except the beautiful voice whispering promises in his ear. The curse had found its second victim, and this was only the beginning.
Part 2. Blood Brothers, Cursed Fortune. Sergeant Williams had been a good man once. The kind of man who'd share his last cigarette with a stranger, who'd carry wounded soldiers through miles of enemy territory, who'd write letters home for boys too scared or too illiterate to write their own. But goodness, you see, is a fragile thing, and the medal didn't want goodness. It wanted something much darker. The change in Williams wasn't immediate. That's the insidious thing about true evil. It doesn't announce itself with thunder and lightning. It creeps in slowly, like poison in your bloodstream, until you don't remember who you used to be. For the first day, Williams seemed almost normal. Better than normal, actually. His aim improved dramatically. His strategic thinking became sharper. He could predict enemy movements with an accuracy that bordered on the supernatural. The other soldiers started calling him lucky, if they only knew what kind of luck he'd bought with his soul. But Captain Morrison knew something was wrong. You don't survive 3 years in the trenches without developing an instinct for danger. danger, and everything about Williams screamed danger now. The way he moved too quietly for a man his size. The way he smiled when he thought no one was looking, and it wasn't a human smile. The way shadows seemed to bend toward him, like they were drawn to something dark. Then there was what happened to Tommy. Poor Tommy, who'd been left a babbling wreck when the medal was torn from him. The boy sat in the medical tent, staring at nothing, whispering the same phrase over and over in that perfect German he'd somehow learned, Es wartet auf den nächsten. It waits for the next one. The medical officer, Dr. Patterson, was baffled. It's like his mind has been hollowed out, he told Morrison, as if something was living inside his head and suddenly left, taking pieces of him with it. Morrison had served with Williams for 2 years. They'd saved each other's lives more times than either could count. They were brothers in everything but blood. But when Morrison looked at Williams now, he saw a stranger wearing his friend's face. The second night after Williams claimed the medal, the nightmare started. Not just for Williams, but for everyone in the company. Vivid, horrifying dreams of battlefields that stretched beyond the horizon, filled with soldiers who fought and died and fought again, in an endless cycle of violence. In every dream there was a figure watching from the shadows, a figure wearing a medal that pulsed like a heartbeat. "It's spreading," whispered Private Carson, a Scottish boy who joined them just weeks earlier. "Whatever that thing is, it's getting into all our heads." But Carson was wrong about one thing. It wasn't getting into their heads randomly. It was choosing, selecting, hunting for the perfect next host. Williams' behavior became increasingly erratic. During a raid on German positions, he single-handedly killed 12 enemy soldiers, not with bullets or grenades, but with his bare hands. The other soldiers found him standing among the bodies, his uniform soaked in blood that wasn't his own, laughing softly to himself. "How did you do it, Sarge?" asked Private Mitchell, a farm boy from Devon who still believed war could be noble. Williams turned to him with those eyes that weren't quite his own anymore. "Easy, lad. You just have to understand what they really want, what they're really afraid of. The metal, it shows you things, truths about human nature that most people are too weak to accept." That night, Mitchell didn't sleep. He couldn't stop thinking about Williams' words, about the way the sergeant had moved through those German soldiers like death itself, and somewhere in the back of his mind, a voice whispered that maybe Williams had found something worth having. The third day brought the real tragedy. Williams was leading a patrol when they encountered a group of German prisoners being escorted to the rear lines. Standard procedure was to let them pass. Prisoner exchanges were supposed to be neutral encounters, but Williams had other ideas. "They're planning something," he told his men, his hand unconsciously reaching for the medal hanging beneath his uniform. "I can see it in their eyes. They're going to break free and attack our positions." The German prisoners were tired and wounded and clearly no threat to anyone. But when Williams spoke, his words carried a weight that made them seem like absolute truth. Before anyone could question the order, Williams opened fire. The massacre lasted less than 2 minutes. When it was over, 8 German prisoners and 2 Allied escorts were dead. Williams stood in the middle of the carnage, reloading his rifle with steady hands. "They would have killed us all," he said simply. "The medal showed me. It's always right." Captain Morrison knew he had to act. That night, he confronted Williams privately. "That medal you're wearing, the one you took from Tommy, it's changing you. Can't you see that?" Williams smiled, and for just a moment, Morrison saw his old friend again. "Change isn't always bad, Captain. Sometimes it's necessary. Sometimes it's the only way to survive in a world gone mad." "Survive at what cost?" Morrison demanded. "Your soul? Souls are luxuries for peacetime. Right now, I need something more practical." Morrison made a decision that would haunt him forever. He couldn't allow Williams to continue leading men while under the influence of whatever dark force had claimed him, but he also couldn't bring himself to simply shoot his oldest friend. Instead, he decided to steal the medal, just like Williams had done with Tommy. The opportunity came during a night raid. Williams was leading a small team to take out a German machine gun nest, and in the chaos of battle, Morrison managed to get close enough. While Williams was focused on the enemy, Morrison reached out and grabbed the chain around his friend's neck. The moment Morrison's fingers touched the metal, everything changed. The world exploded into sensation and knowledge and power beyond anything he'd ever imagined. He could see every German soldier in the area, could predict their movements, could feel their fear like a physical presence. The metal wasn't just showing him the battlefield, it was making him master of it. William spun around, his eyes wide with sudden terror. "No!" he screamed. "You don't understand what you're doing."
But Morrison was already lost. The metal had found its third victim, and this one was perfect. Morrison was intelligent, experienced, and desperately wanted to protect his men. The metal could work with that. It could twist those noble intentions into something beautiful and terrible. Williams fell to his knees, clutching his throat where the chain had been. Without the metal's influence, the full weight of what he'd done came crashing down on him. The prisoners he'd murdered, the men he'd led to their deaths, the friend he'd betrayed. "Please," Williams whispered, "don't let it win. Don't let it use you like it used me." But Morrison wasn't listening. He was hearing other voices now, ancient voices, hungry voices. They were telling him secrets about war and death and power. They were showing him how he could save every man under his command, how he could end this war, how he could become something greater than human. All he had to do was accept their gifts. Williams tried to warn the others, tried to tell them what the metal really was, but who listens to a broken man babbling about curses, especially when Captain Morrison was suddenly performing military miracles? Under Morrison's new leadership, their company went 3 weeks without losing a single man. They won every engagement. They captured strategic positions that had been considered impossible to take. Morrison seemed to know exactly where the enemy would be, exactly what they were planning, exactly how to counter every move they made. The men started calling him the luckiest officer in the entire war. But luck had nothing to do with it. And deep in his heart, Morrison was starting to understand that every victory came with a price. Every life he saved was balanced by lives taken elsewhere. The metal didn't create good fortune. It stole it from others and gave it to him. The question was, how long before the bill came due? And, more importantly, who would be standing close enough to pay it when it did? Part 3. The Messenger of Death. Captain Morrison had always believed in God. Not in the way some men do, desperate and pleading, but quietly, steadily, like a man who'd found something solid to build his life on. But the metal had other plans for his faith. By the 4th week of wearing it, Morrison had seen things that made him question whether God existed at all, and if he did, whether he'd simply abandoned this blood-soaked corner of creation to something far older and hungrier. The signs were everywhere, but Morrison had learned to ignore them. The way his reflections sometimes moved independently in mirrors, the way birds fell dead from the sky when he walked beneath them, the way his own handwriting had begun to change, developing flourishes and symbols he'd never learned, writing messages in margins he couldn't remember creating. But it was the dreams that should have warned him. Every night, the same vision, a vast library filled with books bound in human skin, and sitting at the center, a figure in a uniform he recognized. It was himself, but older, with eyes like black holes, and a smile that belonged on something that had never been human. In the dream, this other Morrison would always say the same thing. "Soon, brother, soon you'll understand the true price of victory." Morrison would wake screaming,
evening, but by morning the memory would fade like smoke. The metal made sure of that. It was very good at protecting itself from inconvenient truths. The company's success continued. In 6 weeks under Morrison's command, they'd captured more territory than any other unit in the sector. His tactical brilliance was becoming legendary. Generals visited just to observe his methods. War correspondents wrote articles about the miracle captain who seemed to have a supernatural understanding of battle. If only they knew how supernatural it really was. Private Mitchell was the first to notice the cost of their success. He'd been keeping a journal, something to send home to his sister after the war. But when he reviewed his entries, he found something disturbing. Every victory Morrison achieved seemed to coincide with disasters befalling other Allied units. When they took Hill 237 without casualties, the Yorkshire Regiment lost 200 men in a failed assault 20 miles away. When they captured an entire German supply depot, an Australian company was wiped out by a gas attack that seemed to come from nowhere. It's like our good luck is being paid for with other people's lives, Mitchell confided to Corporal Davis, a veteran who'd served with Morrison since before the medal. But Davis laughed it off at first. "You're being superstitious, lad. War is random. Sometimes you're lucky, sometimes you're not." But then Davis started noticing things too. How Morrison always seemed to know exactly where enemy patrols would be. How their supply lines never got cut while others suffered constant raids. How the weather always seemed to favor their operations while hindering everyone else's. Most disturbing of all was what happened during the Battle of Messines Ridge. Morrison's company was supposed to be part of a joint assault with 3 other units, but the night before the attack, Morrison received what he claimed were revised orders to hold back while the others went forward. The 3 other companies walked into a carefully prepared German trap and were slaughtered to the last man. Morrison's unit moved in afterward to claim the position without firing a single shot. "How did you know?" asked Davis afterward, studying Morrison's face for any sign of the man he'd once known. Morrison's hand went unconsciously to his chest, where the medal hung hidden beneath his uniform. "Intelligence reports," he said simply. But his eyes told a different story. In those depths, Davis saw something looking back that knew far more about death than any living man should know. That night, Davis made a decision that would seal his fate. He'd served with Morrison for 2 years and considered him the finest officer he'd ever known. But this thing wearing Morrison's face was something else entirely, and Davis couldn't stand by while good men died to feed its hunger for victory. He confronted Morrison in the captain's dugout, where Morrison sat writing reports by candlelight. But as Davis watched, the handwriting on the page wasn't English. It was something older, symbols that hurt to look at directly. "Captain," he said carefully, "I need to ask you about something." Morrison looked up, and for just a moment, Davis saw his old friend again, tired, confused, fighting something inside his own head. "What is it, Corporal?" "That medal you're wearing, the one that belonged to Tommy, then Williams. I think it's affecting your judgment." The change was instantaneous. Morrison's face went cold, his eyes becoming flat and lifeless. "I don't know what you're talking about." But Davis pressed on. He'd come too far to back down now. "The other companies, sir, the ones that died while we held back. How did you really know about the trap?" Morrison stood slowly, and Davis noticed for the first time how the shadows in the dugout seemed to bend toward the captain, like iron filings toward a magnet. "I know because I'm good at my job, Corporal, because I pay attention, because I do what's necessary to keep my men alive." "But what about the men in those other companies? What about their lives?" Morrison smiled, and it was the most terrifying thing Davis had ever seen. "There are no devils here, Corporal. Only soldiers doing their duty." But Davis could see the truth now, could see how Morrison's uniform hung differently, as if the metal beneath it weighed more than any piece of metal should, could see how Morrison's shadow fell wrong, too dark and too long for the candlelight. "Take it off," he said quietly. "Whatever that thing is, take it off before it destroys you completely." Morrison laughed, and the sound echoed strangely in the small space. "Take it off? You don't understand, do you? I can't take it off. It's part of me now. We're connected. It needs me, and I need it. Without it, I'm just another officer sending boys to die for a few yards of mud. With it, I can actually make a difference. By stealing luck from other units? By trading their lives for ours?"
Morrison's expression grew thoughtful. "Is that what you think this is? Simple theft?" He pulled the metal from beneath his uniform, and Davis gasped. The thing had changed. What Tommy had found was beautiful in its own twisted way. This was something else entirely, black as midnight, covered in symbols that seemed to writhe and shift, pulsing with its own internal light. "This is evolution, Corporal. This is humanity's next step. War isn't about good and evil anymore. It's about survival, about adaptation, about becoming something stronger than what we were." Davis backed toward the entrance of the dugout. "You're not human anymore, are you?" Morrison tilted his head, considering the question. "I'm what humanity needs to become. What we all will become eventually. The metal doesn't just choose its bearers, you see. It prepares them. It teaches them. It shows them truths about the nature of existence that most minds couldn't handle." "What truths?" Morrison's smile widened. "That there are no innocent casualties in war. That victory is the only virtue that matters. That power is the only protection against chaos. That everything you were taught about morality and conscience was just training wheels." Davis realized with growing horror that Morrison wasn't trying to justify what he'd become. He genuinely believed it. The metal had rewritten his fundamental understanding of right and wrong, turning his desire to protect his men into something monstrous. "I won't let you keep using it," Davis said, drawing his sidearm. "I won't let you keep trading other people's lives for our success." Morrison didn't move, didn't even seem concerned about the gun. "Are you going to shoot your commanding officer, Corporal? That would be mutiny, a capital offense, better than being an accomplice to whatever you've become." Morrison nodded slowly. "I understand. You're trying to be noble, trying to do the right thing. I was like that once. But nobility is a luxury we can't afford in war. Let me show you what real responsibility looks like." Before Davis could react, Morrison lunged forward. But he moved wrong, too fast, too fluid, like something that had learned to mimic human movement but hadn't quite perfected it. Davis got one shot off before Morrison's hands closed around his throat. The last thing Davis saw was Morrison's face, filled with something that might have been pity. "I'm sorry, old friend, but the metal has chosen its next bearer, and I'm afraid that's you." As darkness closed in, Davis felt cold metal being pressed against his chest. The metal. It was warm to the touch, almost alive, and the moment it made contact with his skin, Davis understood everything. The hunger, the power, the beautiful, terrible logic of it all. When he opened his eyes, Morrison was lying dead at his feet, and Davis was holding a smoking pistol, but he couldn't remember pulling the trigger. The metal hung around his neck now, and it whispered promises in his ear. Promises of victory, of survival, of the strength to do what needed to be done. Davis looked down at Morrison's body and felt nothing, just a mild satisfaction that an obstacle had been removed. The man who would have stopped him was gone, and now he could get back to the important work of winning this war. He had reports to write, plans to make, a company to protect, and somewhere in the back of his mind, a small voice was screaming about what he'd become. But the metal knew how to deal with inconvenient voices. It was very good at making them quiet.
Part 4. Breaking Point. Corporal Davis
Davis had always prided himself on being a logical man, a man who could look at a problem, break it down into manageable pieces, and find a solution. But logic doesn't work when you're fighting something that shouldn't exist. Logic doesn't help when you realize you've become the very monster you tried to destroy. The first 24 hours after claiming the medal were the worst. Davis would find himself standing in places with no memory of walking there. He'd discover notes in his own handwriting describing battle plans he'd never conceived, written in a hand that was his, but somehow different, more confident, more cruel. And the whispers, God, the whispers. They never stopped. Voices in languages he didn't recognize, but somehow understood. They spoke of ancient battlefields where the dead never stayed buried, of wars that had been fought since the dawn of time between forces that had no names, of a hunger that existed long before humanity learned to make weapons and would exist long after the last human fell. But unlike Tommy, Williams, and Morrison, Davis had one advantage. He'd watched the others fall. He'd seen the pattern. And somewhere in the small part of his mind that the medal hadn't yet claimed, he understood that he was in a race against time. Either he found a way to break free, or he'd become just another stepping stone in the medal's journey to something even worse. The breakthrough came during the third night. Davis was sitting in what had been Morrison's dugout, trying to make sense of the captain's final reports. Hidden among the tactical assessments and casualty lists, he found something else, a journal written in Morrison's own hand, but in a cipher that took Davis hours to decode. What he found made his blood run cold. Morrison hadn't just been aware of what was happening to him. He'd been fighting it. For weeks, the captain had been documenting the medal's influence, trying to understand its history, desperately searching for a way to break the curse before it consumed him completely. The entries painted a horrifying picture. Day 12. The medal showed me a vision today, a battlefield from centuries ago. Romans fighting Germanic tribes. One of the Roman centurions was wearing something around his neck, the same symbol, the same hunger in his eyes. Day 18. I understand now why it chooses soldiers. War feeds it. Death feeds it. But it's not just about killing. It's about corruption, about taking men who would die for noble causes and turning them into something that kills for pleasure. Day 23. I tried to remove it again today. My hand shook so badly I couldn't even touch the chain. It's burrowing deeper. Soon there won't be enough of me left to resist. Day 39. Davis suspects something. Good man, Davis. If something happens to me, I pray he's stronger than I am, but I fear the medal has already chosen its next victim. The final entry was barely legible, written in a hand that shook with either terror or anticipation. Day 35. I can feel it happening. The final transformation. Tomorrow I won't be Morrison anymore. I'll be something wearing his face. God forgive me, but part of me is looking forward to it. The constant fighting is so exhausting. It would be easier to just let go. Davis set the journal aside with trembling hands. Morrison had fought for over a month and still lost. How long did that give him? How long before there wouldn't be enough of Davis left to care about breaking free? But Morrison had discovered something else in his research. References to the medal in historical accounts going back centuries. A Roman centurion who single-handedly conquered 3 Gallic tribes before being found dead with his throat torn out. A Viking berserker whose victories were so impossible they were attributed to divine favor until he slaughtered his own warband in a fit of madness. A crusader knight who never lost a battle but left a trail of murdered allies across the Holy Land. Always the same pattern. Initial success beyond all reason. Growing paranoia and violence. Then death, usually at the hands of someone close, someone who discovered the truth. And always, the medal would disappear, only to surface again years later in another war, around another soldier's neck. But there was something else. A detail that Morrison had circled repeatedly in his notes. Every historical account mentioned the same thing. In their final moments, each bearer had tried to destroy the medal. Not give it away, not hide it, but actually destroy it. And every one had failed, except one, a Confederate officer named Colonel James Whitmore, fighting in the American Civil War. According to a diary entry Morrison had copied from a military museum, Whitmore had managed to wound the metal, not destroy it, but damage it. The account was fragmented, but it spoke of breaking the vessel and spilling the darkness back to where it came from. Whitmore had died in the attempt, but for 3 days after his death the metal was dormant. 3 days where it couldn't influence anyone, couldn't spread its corruption. 3 days where it was just a piece of metal. Davis stared at this information, feeling hope for the first time since Morrison's death. If Whitmore had found a way to wound it, maybe someone could find a way to kill it completely. But first, he needed to understand what the metal actually was. The answer came from an unexpected source. Father McCready, the company chaplain, had been visiting the wounded when Davis approached him. McCready was an old Irish priest who'd seen more death than most soldiers, and there was a wisdom in his eyes that came from confronting humanity's darkest impulses and still believing in redemption. "Father," Davis said carefully, "hypothetically speaking, if someone were cursed, what would that mean? Theologically speaking." McCready studied him with sharp eyes. "Hypothetically? Well, I'd say true curses are rare things, lad. Most of what people call curses are just consequences dressed up in supernatural clothing. But when they do exist, they're usually not punishments. They're traps." Traps? Something ancient and malevolent, looking for a way into our world. A curse isn't a spell, lad. It's an invitation, a doorway. And every time someone accepts that invitation, they make the door a little wider. Davis felt his blood turn to ice. And if someone wanted to close that door... McCready's expression grew troubled. That would require sacrifice, wouldn't it? Real sacrifice. The kind that costs everything. That night, Davis made his decision. He couldn't fight the metal's influence much longer. He could feel it growing stronger every hour. But maybe he didn't need to fight it. Maybe he needed to embrace it completely, push it to its limits, and then strike when it was most vulnerable. It was a desperate plan, probably a suicidal one, but it was the only chance he had. Davis began by giving in to the metal's whispers. He stopped fighting its tactical suggestions, stopped resisting its hunger for victory. Under its guidance, his company achieved impossible success. They captured fortified positions that should have cost hundreds of lives without losing a single man. They anticipated enemy movements with supernatural accuracy. They seemed invincible. But Davis was watching, learning, waiting for his moment. The metal's power came from death and despair. It fed on the corruption of good men and the destruction of hope. But what if someone fed it too much, too quickly? What if someone overwhelmed it with more darkness than it could digest? Davis began implementing increasingly ruthless tactics. He sent false intelligence to other units, leading them into traps. He sabotaged supply lines to friendly forces. He orchestrated disasters that would benefit his company at the cost of Allied lives. And with each atrocity, the metal grew hungrier, greedier, more reckless. The other soldiers in his company began to notice changes, not just in Davis, but in reality itself around him. Shadows moved independently of their sources. The temperature dropped whenever he entered a room. Animals fled from his presence, and plants withered when he touched them.
But most disturbing of all were the men he commanded. They were changing too, becoming more aggressive, more callous, more willing to follow orders without question. The metal wasn't just corrupting Davis, it was using him to corrupt everyone around him. Private Mitchell was the first to confront him about it. "Corporal," Mitchell said quietly, approaching Davis after a particularly brutal engagement where they'd let an entire Australian unit walk into an ambush rather than warn them. "What's happening to us?" Davis looked at the young soldier and saw something that made his heart break. Mitchell's eyes, once bright with idealism and hope, were now flat and cold. The metal's influence was spreading through the company like a disease. "We're winning, Private," Davis said simply. "That's what's happening." "But at what cost? Those Australians! We could have saved them. We knew what was going to happen." The metal pulsed against his chest, feeding on Mitchell's distress, growing stronger with every word of moral conflict. Their lives aren't our responsibility, soldier. Our responsibility is to this company, to victory. The words were Morrison's. Morrison's philosophy, Morrison's justifications coming out of Davis's mouth. The cycle was repeating itself, and Davis realized with growing horror that he was running out of time. That night, Davis made his final preparations. He'd learned everything he could about the metal's nature, its history, its weaknesses. He'd pushed it to the very edge of its power, made it drunk on corruption and death. Now came the dangerous part. Now came the moment when he'd either save his soul or lose it forever. Davis looked around the dugout one last time, at Morrison's notes, at his own research, at the evidence of how far he'd fallen in just 2 weeks. Outside, he could hear his men preparing for tomorrow's assault, an assault he'd planned specifically to maximize carnage and chaos. The metal whispered promises in his ear, promises of ultimate victory, of power beyond imagination, of transformation into something greater than human. For the first time since claiming the cursed thing, Davis smiled back. "Yes," he whispered to the darkness, "let's see just how much power you really have." Tomorrow would bring the final test. Tomorrow Davis would either break the cycle that had claimed Tommy, Williams, and Morrison, or he'd become something so much worse than any of them had ever been. The metal pulsed with anticipation, unaware that its newest bearer had been.
Dawn came like a bleeding wound across the sky, and Corporal Davis knew it would be the last sunrise he'd see as anything resembling human. The metal had been whispering to him all night, showing him visions of the glorious future that awaited. Not just victory in this war, but victory in all wars. Not just power over his company, but power over nations. The thing around his neck had been patient for centuries, but its patience was finally paying off. Davis had become everything it needed him to be. The plan was perfect in its horrifying simplicity. Today's assault would pit Davis's company against a heavily fortified German position. Normally, it would be suicide, but under the metal's guidance, Davis had orchestrated something far more sinister. 3 other Allied companies would attack simultaneously from different angles, each one following intelligence that Davis had carefully manipulated. The Germans would be expecting them, all of them. It would be a massacre. Hundreds of Allied soldiers would die in the space of an hour, and their deaths would feed the metal more power than it had consumed in decades. Enough power to complete its transformation of Davis. Enough power to open that doorway Father McCready had spoken of and let something truly ancient step into the modern world. But as Davis stood in the pre-dawn darkness, checking his rifle and preparing for what he believed would be his final moments of humanity, he smiled, because the metal had made one crucial mistake. It thought Davis had broken. In reality, he'd been playing a part. For 2 weeks, he'd forced himself to become the monster the metal wanted, fighting against every instinct, every moral fiber, every decent impulse he'd ever had. He'd let it think it was winning, while he prepared for this moment, the moment when it would be so drunk on anticipated power that its guard would be completely down. Davis had learned from Morrison's research that the metal's strength came from corruption, from taking good men and twisting them into instruments of evil. But what Morrison hadn't understood was that corruption worked both ways. Just as the metal could poison a man's soul could poison the metal.
if someone fed it the wrong kind of darkness. Davis reached into his pack and pulled out the tools he'd been secretly preparing. Holy water from Father Nacredy's service, salt from the trenches where thousands of men had died with prayers on their lips, and most importantly, a piece of metal he'd carved from a shell fragment, iron that had been blessed by the chaplain and sanctified with the blood of men who died trying to save their friends rather than kill their enemies. The metal pulsed against his chest, sensing something but not yet understanding the threat. It was too focused on the coming feast to notice the trap closing around it. "Time to move out," Davis called to his men, and was horrified to see how readily they obeyed. The metal's influence had turned them into extensions of its will. They followed him not out of loyalty or duty, but because they'd been programmed to. As they moved through the trenches toward their assault position, Davis caught sight of the other companies preparing for their own attacks. Good men, brave men, who had no idea they were walking into a slaughter designed to feed something that should never have existed. For just a moment, Davis wavered. Was he really willing to let all those soldiers die just for a chance? Not even a guarantee, just a chance to destroy the metal? What kind of man did that make him? The metal whispered reassurances, told him it was necessary, promised him that their sacrifice would serve a greater purpose. And that's when Davis knew his plan would work, because the metal had made its second crucial mistake. It had shown him what it really feared. Not death, not destruction, not even being removed or hidden away. It feared being denied its feast. Davis signaled his men to halt just short of their assault position. According to the plan, they would wait here until the other companies began their attacks, then move forward to claim the position after the Germans had exhausted their ammunition on the decoy assaults. But Davis had other plans. "Listen to me carefully," he told his men, his voice carrying an authority that came from not the metal, but from something deeper, something the metal had tried to destroy but couldn't quite reach. He told them everything about Tommy and the German officer, about Williams and Morrison and himself, about what the metal really was and what it was trying to do, about the centuries of soldiers who'd fallen to its influence and the wars that had been fought to feed its hunger. Most importantly, he told them about the choice they all faced in the next few minutes. Some of the men laughed, some accused him of shell shock, but a few, the ones who'd been fighting the longest, who'd seen enough of war's horrors to believe that worse things were possible, listened. Private Mitchell was the first to understand. "The feeling I've been having," he said slowly, "like I don't care about anything anymore. Like killing is just normal. That's not me." "None of us are ourselves anymore," Davis said. "The metal doesn't just corrupt its bearer. It corrupts everyone around him. But we can fight it. We can choose to be better than what it's made us." The metal was pulsing frantically now, sending waves of compulsion through Davis's nervous system. It wanted him to stop talking, to get back to the plan, to focus on the beautiful carnage that was about to unfold. Instead, Davis reached up and grabbed the chain around his neck. The moment his fingers closed around it, the world exploded in sensation. The metal shrieked, not audibly, but in a frequency that vibrated through bone and soul. Images flashed through his mind, every bearer throughout history, every moment of corruption, every life lost to feed its hunger. But he also saw something else, something the metal hadn't meant to show him. He saw its true form. The metal wasn't an object at all. It was a wound, a tear in the fabric of reality that led to somewhere humanity was never meant to know about. And every death it caused, every soul it claimed, made that wound a little wider. Davis understood now why Colonel Whitmore had managed to wound it during the Civil War. He hadn't tried to destroy the metal itself. He'd tried to heal the wound it represented. With hands that shook from more than just physical effort, Davis pulled out the tools he'd been preparing. The holy water burned his fingers as he poured it over the metal. The blessed salt made the metal hiss and smoke, but it was the sanctified iron that did the real damage. The moment the iron touched the metal surface, reality screamed. The air around Davis began to tear
tear, revealing glimpses of something vast and terrible on the other side. His men scattered, some fleeing in terror, others standing their ground despite every instinct telling them to run. But Davis held on. The metal was fighting back now, pouring every ounce of its accumulated power into stopping him. He felt his body aging years in seconds, felt his sanity fraying at the edges, felt the thing on the other side of that wound pressing against the barriers, trying to claw its way through. "Help me!" Davis screamed to his men. Mitchell was the first to respond, grabbing Davis's shoulders to steady him. Then Carson, adding his strength to the effort. One by one, the men who'd followed Davis into hell grabbed hold of him, lending him their will, their humanity, their stubborn refusal to let evil win. And slowly, impossibly, the wound began to close. The metal cracked. Not physically. It was beyond physical now, but spiritually. Centuries of accumulated darkness began spilling out like poison from a burst abscess. The thing on the other side shrieked in rage and frustration as its pathway back into the world collapsed. Davis understood now why Colonel Whitmore had managed to wound it during the Civil War. He hadn't tried to destroy the metal itself. He'd tried to heal the wound it represented. With hands that shook from more than just physical effort, Davis pulled out the tools he'd been preparing. The holy water burned his fingers as he poured it over the metal. The blessed salt made the metal hiss and smoke, but it was the sanctified iron that did the real damage. The moment the iron touched the metal surface, reality screamed. The air around Davis began to tear, revealing glimpses of something vast and terrible on the other side. His men scattered, some fleeing in terror, others standing their ground, despite every instinct telling them to run. But Davis held on. The metal was fighting back now, pouring every ounce of its accumulated power into stopping him. He felt his body aging years in seconds, felt his sanity fraying at the edges, felt the thing on the other side of that wound pressing against the barriers, trying to claw its way through. "Help me!" Davis screamed to his men. "I can't hold it alone!" Mitchell was the first to respond, grabbing Davis's shoulders to steady him. Then Carson, adding his strength to the effort. One by one, the men who'd followed Davis into hell grabbed hold of him, lending him their will, their humanity, their stubborn refusal to let evil win. And slowly, impossibly, the wound began to close. The metal cracked. Not physically. It was beyond physical now, but spiritually. Centuries of accumulated darkness began spilling out like poison from a burst abscess. The thing on the other side shrieked in rage and frustration as its pathway back into the world collapsed. The metal around his neck crumbled to dust. Davis collapsed, gasping, surrounded by his men who were staring at him with expressions ranging from terror to awe to profound relief. In the distance, he could hear the sound of battle as the other companies began their assaults that would now proceed according to their original, non-corrupted plans. Men would still die today. War was still war, but they wouldn't die to feed something that had been masquerading as victory while devouring souls. "Is it over?" Mitchell asked quietly. Davis nodded, though he couldn't speak. The effort of breaking the metal had left him drained in ways he didn't fully understand, but he could feel it. The absence where the whispers used to be. The lifting of a weight he didn't realize he'd been carrying. It was over. Father McCready found them an hour later, drawn by reports of strange lights and unnatural sounds from their position. He took one look at Davis's face and nodded knowingly. "You faced something dark, didn't you, son?" "We all did, Father," Davis replied, looking at his men, his friends, who'd stood with him when it mattered most. "But we faced it together." McCready smiled. "That's usually how evil gets defeated, you know. Not by heroes acting alone, but by ordinary people choosing to stand together against the darkness." As they made their way back to the main lines, Davis thought about Tommy, probably still in a medical facility somewhere, his mind shattered by his brief contact with the metal. About Williams, who'd died consumed by guilt over what he'd done. About Morrison, who'd fought
the curse until the very end and died trying to save the man who would eventually break it. Their sacrifices hadn't been in vain. The cycle was broken. The wound was healed. But Davis knew there would be other curses, other temptations, other moments when good men would have to choose between easy power and hard righteousness. War would continue to create such moments, would continue to test the souls of those caught in its machinery. The difference was, now they knew such things could be defeated. Now they knew that even the darkest corruption could be overcome by people who refused to surrender their humanity. As they walked back toward the trenches, Mitchell fell into step beside Davis. "Corporal," he said quietly, "what do you think would have happened if we hadn't stopped it?" I considered the question seriously. I thought about the visions the metal had shown me, about the ancient thing that had been waiting on the other side of that wound, about what the world might have become if that doorway had opened completely. "I think," he said finally, "that we would have won this war, and every war after it, and eventually there wouldn't have been anything left worth winning." Mitchell nodded, seeming to understand. "Good thing we stopped it then." "Good thing we all stopped it," Davis corrected. "None of us could have done it alone." Behind them, the sun was rising fully now, burning away the last shadows of night. Ahead, the sounds of war continued, but they were the sounds of human conflict now, not supernatural hunger. It wasn't peace, but it was a chance for peace to be possible, and sometimes that's all you can ask for. The curse of the metal was broken. The soldiers who'd given everything to break it were finally free, and somewhere in the growing daylight, the war went on, fought now by men and women who were fully, completely, courageously human.